So we're going to roll from existing buildings into new buildings and what's happening with regard to TS 1170.5 as well as what's happening with the Seismic Risk Working Group for further updates to TS 1170.5. This is going to be a three-way presentation between myself, Rob Jury, and John Hare. Up first, if we can get the slides, will be Rob to give us an update on how the TS 1170.5 is coming along.
Thanks, Ken. I'm speaking to you today as the chair of the TS committee. When I was putting this together, I did contemplate calling the title, "Where is the TS?" or even putting a question mark on the 5, or even on the 25, because you'll all be wondering what's been happening. Very careful not to push the red one. Yeah, big one. Yeah. So where have we been? About this time last year, the consultation period for the draft TS was completed. In fact, probably in about another 7 days, a year ago. And as a result of that, we had nearly 600 comments made, and it was a relatively short period, 6 to 8 weeks of consultation. About 600 comments made on the code itself, and about nearly 200 on the commentary. Those comments were made in a variety of different areas, and they're broken up in the pie diagrams you can see on the screen. I won't go through those in detail. What's of interest is that over 75% of those comments were received from users, consultants using the document. The other comments came from the likes of BCAs, developers, owners, the research community, and technical societies and other companies. And some of those responses were by letter. So those are in addition to what's shown on these pie diagrams. It's interesting that they are broken down into those various areas, and there's a lot of editorial stuff that people pick up. It's amazing how many eyes on a document will pick up the editorial stuff. But there were a lot of other comments made also, and a lot of comments made around the potential impact of the TS, and no doubt you will have the same views on that, particularly if you live in a high seismic area, and Wellington got the focus of all of that. So, so those letters were pleas for not to hit people too hard with the wind, especially Wellington, with the seismic hazard requirements, etc., and various other aspects. How did we respond to that? Well, the committee that I chair is about 8 to 10 people. We created working groups that looked at each one of those, particularly those items that were the ones with a major amount of numbers of comments. We split the group up into that, and we also brought in people from outside the committee too, who had particular expertise to sit on those working groups. And so there were 8 working groups. They are the 8 that are up there on the screen, covering everything from general matters. The editorial was obvious. Geotechnical received quite a lot of comment because it was the first time geotechnical matters, as was discussed this morning, were in the context of a loading standard. So there were a lot of comments about geotechnical matters and the way they had been dealt with. There was a lot around risk, and in addition to the deliberations on the comments that were made, the working groups also looked into some other issues, which I'll talk about in a moment. Rocking was another one because that appeared for the first time after many years back into the standard, so there were a few comments on that. Parts received comments. And then there were a number of comments that we decided were really items that the Seismic Risk Working Group, which was already sitting at that time and continuing on in its work, would be best to look at as part of a future TS. And that will be discussed in the next, with the next presentations. And then there were a large number of things about relating, you could say, were policy, and those were not dealt with by the technical committee that I chair, but were handed over to MB to consider around those aspects I talked about, hazard and what have you. So some key issues have been addressed. One is the removal of the near fault factor. This didn't necessarily come out of comments, but it was thought that maybe the near fault factor was it already included within the seismic hazard estimates that had already been presented, and the committee was convinced that it was, and so have removed the near fault factor. This adjusts the spectra, obviously, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Also, you know, there's been a lot of talk about the Wellington Basin effects as one basin, and we had an amendment ready to go but wasn't promulgated some years ago on the basin. It's now considered that that is also inherently included within the hazard analysis that's been done for Wellington. We had a look also at a variable TD. When you're trying to match spectra from a whole lot of different areas and you're trying to get it into consistent form, if you recall, the draft TS had TD set at 3 seconds. We've now gone for a variable TD, and that allows us to fit the spectra a bit better. I won't say more precise, or I won't even say more accurate, just fits it better. So also it was felt too that there were some good arguments around why some of the softer ground, you know, something beyond soil class 4, reasons why that might not be able to propagate some of these motions. And the work that's been done to date has concentrated on PGA and has come up with some reductions for the PGA for the softer grounds based on non-linear soil behaviour. And that runs out to 0.1 seconds, so it's arguably in the spectral range, but in the very short end. It's just that the work hasn't been done on what effect it has on other spectral values yet. So an item for a future TS. All those three lead to changes in the spectra, design spectra. However, it would be fair to say they're not the changes that some of the commentators might have hoped for. They don't change the design values to that extent. So Wellington is still quite high. Along with other things, there's been changes to the site class definitions, primarily around getting rid of some anomalies. When people start to use these things and see them in the flesh, they can point out the foibles in them, so they have hopefully been dealt with, and also providing more clarification around that, and also the default site classes. So hopefully they're more logical now. There are amendments to evaluating VS30 and dealing with the uncertainties involved in that, but they're really fiddling on the edges. And then we have changed the format of the parameter table. So previously, if you recall, it was on the basis of return period, all the locations listed, and another table for another return period, all the locations. We've now brought all the locations together, and they are listed in terms of return period just in one row. Papers have started to come out on the rationale for these changes and other changes that were already in the draft. They were in the March bulletin, and there's another series of them that are expected in the June bulletin. So there'll be more information around the justification for some of these changes generally. So the current time frame, said with some trepidation, the revised draft TS, including all those changes and dealing with all the comments, is about to be issued for committee balloting, and we're hoping that that's a formality. I didn't say, but it was on the slide, that there have been 7 committee meetings to deal with the reports back from all those working groups for the committee. We'll have to address any issues from that balloting. Hopefully that's a small number. There'll be a final editing process by standards, and then we expect publication. And we're really hoping we can do that by the end of July. So we do have some feeling that we can do that. We think we've got the draft as of this week in a form that can go to the, almost, probably next week, go to the committee, and then there'll be some balloting. And just to finish, I just want to acknowledge the groups that are involved in doing these exercises on committees. This is not paid work, so it's voluntary. And I just want to acknowledge that there are many people involved in getting these standards done, and it is on a voluntary basis. And these are the organisations that people represent, but of course their home organisations are also supporting the people. So there's a large number of organisations that are assisting with this process.
Thanks, Rob. And I want to acknowledge your effort, Rob, as chair of the TS committee. It has been a significant effort to get it to this point. So thank you for that. So just a few words about what comes after the release of the TS. And I, too, decided to cross my fingers and put the 5 on the end of that. It will be released for use as an alternative solution pathway. NZS 1170.5 2004 remains the cited standard within B1 VM1. But those of you who choose to use it voluntarily, there will be a mechanism by which you can provide feedback to MB, which will be really important for us for any future consideration of the development of a regulatory impact analysis that would be needed for any future siting. But we do not intend on citing this initial version of the TS, as I'll talk about in a moment, with the efforts ongoing around stage 2, which John's going to give us a preview of. It makes sense for us to bring that new knowledge in before we seek to cite the TS. If you do decide to use the TS, use it in its entirety. Don't mix and match between 1170.5 2004 and the TS. There are differences in the way the seismic hazard is arrived at. One of those that Rob identified was the near fault factor. It's appropriate within the NZS 1170.5. It is not appropriate within the TS. For assessments, continue to use 1170.5 2004, and for all assessments, whether it's within the EPB system or outside the EPB system. Many of you have heard me say this too many times, but I point you to this really good document by NZSEE that talked about how one should approach both assessments and retrofit in light of the TS being released. While you may have put that aside while you were waiting for the TS to come out, now that the TS is relatively imminent, I highly recommend you go back to this document. It's a good read. So The TS was essentially started by the efforts of the Seismic Risk Working Group under what we called Stage 1. That was a minimum viable product to get the outputs of the National Seismic Hazard Model in a form that was usable by the profession. That led to the TS that we have today. But it was always intended that that was Stage 1, and of course, Stage 1 has to be followed by Stage 2. Stage 2 was where we were to look at more fundamental updates to our approach to seismic design to lead to better outcomes for society from our built environment. It was always intended that this would then lead to further updates to the TS. And so that's what we want to focus on for the rest of our presentation here. The Stage 2 has been underway now for about a year. One of the first things we did was consider the whole table of contents of the TS. It is intentionally too small so that you can't read it or even take a picture of it. I think it's too blurry to read. We thought about its organization, thought about a few parts that were actually needed to be expanded, such as the geotechnical components that were brought in Stage 1, but we want to expand in Stage 2, add a section specific to diaphragms and foundations. It's grown a bit, as codes tend to do, unfortunately. But the one thing that's essentially staying the same, is the seismic hazard. That was the focus of our Stage 1. The seismic hazard is essentially remaining the same. But how we use that seismic hazard within design, that is changing. With that, I'd like to invite John Hare up to talk about the front end of this, sections 1 to 3, which have just gone through balloting by the Seismic Risk Working Group. But I should emphasize here that this is all still in development, okay? We're giving you a sneak peek, but please don't hold us to it if things change from what we talk about here today, because this is definitely still something that is building the airplane as we fly type thing. All right, over to John.
Okay, thanks, Ken. I'm not sure if you've set me up to succeed or fail on that count, but anyway. So what we're going to talk about today is sections 1 to 3, as you can in a minute see. That was not the right one.
Keep going.
There we go. Of the very fine print which Ken just showed you a minute ago. I'm not sure quite how I drew the short straw for this. There are a lot of other people who have been contributing to this, so please, when you come up with your questions, don't assume that it was all me that did this stuff to you. However, moving on. I think I was told 20 minutes. It looks like we've got until 6, so that's plenty of time to really enjoy this, so buckle in. Preview there, these are the things I want to talk about today. So the key points, we'll go through them one by one, but the first one you'll see there is importance levels, which is not actually something which was in 1170.5. I'm sure you'll all have noticed. It's actually 1170.0. However, we felt this was a very important part of the whole equation, and so we have lifted that out for the purposes of seismic design. And you could argue, why are we tampering with that, given what an important thing it is, obviously, and how long it's been in place? And so I'd just like to go through and perhaps address some of the points. The first one there, you'll notice that little extract on the left, which is the part of B1, which tells you what it's all about, really. And the key points in there are, of course, that it's got a split role. One part is life safety, the other part is amenity, ignoring for a moment section C, which is a separate topic. And if you look at the diagram on the right, you'll note what has been a little bit of an inconsistency all this time, where we've had just IL4, which has really been addressing amenity, and the others have addressed it to a certain extent with SLS1, but at a very low level. But essentially, we've got two axes to what importance level is trying to do, and there's really only been one part of the importance levels which has addressed that fully and consistently. And so the dotted bubbles we could put in there, we could have simply shifted IL2 and IL3 onto that same line. And in fact, one of the amendments, earlier amendments, which as Rob mentioned has been held back, did propose doing that. But then the interesting thing to consider is, does it make sense that what causes us to view a building as having importance in one context at a certain level, so amenity, tells us we should have the same shift when it comes to life safety? Do those match up? So what if you've got the critical facility, for example, at your hospital, which houses only 1 or 2 people? It's very important from an amenity perspective, not so much so maybe from a life safety perspective. So how do we manage those contradictions? Another issue with importance levels for a long time, I think, has been table 3.2, which I was discussing with someone actually earlier. It's wonderful the discussions you have at earthquake conferences, isn't it? And where, as you know, it's got a lot of inconsistencies in there, a lot of strange things potentially happening, a lot of things which are a little bit inexplicable. Somewhere in there, I think you'll find discussion about colleges, which is clearly places it in a US origin. And so we asked the question, where did this come from? Why is it like that? And so some of the anomalies. The one that I've been observing for some time and never quite reconciled is the exchange rate. So how come it is that 5,000 adults is worth 500 university students, 250 school pupils, 250 people in public transport terminals, 150 preschoolers, 50 patients, and 0 inmates, all of which are the thresholds for going from IL2 to IL3. How do we get to those numbers? Why are they there? And how do we rationalise that if we can? There are questions associated with that, of course, around whether these people are ambulatory or non-ambulatory, whether they're confined or not confined, as the case may be. But even those, you can look at it and say, well, hang on a minute. Obviously, ambulatory, non-ambulatory, and in certain safety contexts, for example, fire, that's very important. What do we tell people to do in an earthquake? Drop, cover, and hold. Don't move. Stay in the building. And so some of these things we can't quite reconcile. How do we get to that point? There's obviously a lot of other factors involved, but it did seem like it was something which needed addressing. Why is it that we fret about 300 people in one space in a building, as the IL3 threshold, versus having up to 5,000 distributed through the building? Surely if we're talking about structural stability, that seems a little bit hard to fathom. On the other hand, if we were thinking about it in terms of, for example, a big, elaborate, heavy-looking ceiling sitting right above us waiting to come down, you might say, yes, indeed, that could be a problem, but perhaps that's something we should be addressing somewhere else with parts, for example, which is actually where we get to do something about it. And so there are quite a lot of things in this table which seemed quite difficult to rationalise. IL4 could set the life safety provision for one person at a 2,500-year earthquake, and yet that's 1.8 times what we might have for 5,000 people in an IL2 building. So once again, lots and lots of things which are difficult to understand. So, to conclude, what we have at the moment is a lot of fairly inexplicable risk metrics and a certain amount of confusion between life safety and amenity. And so, we thought the best thing to do was to try and split the two. And so what we've introduced is, rather than have importance levels to determine seismic loads, we're talking about introducing 2 categories. Functionality category, obviously aimed at amenity, and occupancy category. And so, in the case of the functionality category, this is a reflection of what we expect of buildings in the response and recovery phases of the earthquake. When it's most important, we need to know that the building is going to be operable. These words are somewhat legible, unfortunately. I'm not following Ken's lead on that one, so don't take too much notice of them. But the general principle is that we have different levels of functionality category related to the requirements, as I say, for what needs to be, what the building needs to be able to do in the response and recovery phase, going all the way from F0, which is essentially buildings which don't have any particular requirement. That might be your, dare I say it, the farm sheds, the hay barns. Sorry, Henry, no reflection on your background, that's mine as well. Which we don't worry about so much, all the way up to buildings having a post-disaster response function, a critical function. And so that's the traditional IL4 buildings as we think of them right now. Occupancy category, fairly obviously to do with the number of people put at risk. And so, when we talk about that, that'll look very familiar as well, but without the overlay of amenity. And so these things are purely related to the number of people which may be at risk in a building. All the way from the low risk exposure, very similar to what we have currently, all the way up through to the OC4, which is currently IL5. So the ones which we have to do by special study. What that means is that we can then start setting our annual probability of exceedance separately according to whether it's an amenity issue or a life safety issue. And each of those we're then looking at in the context more of along the lines of SLS2 as we think of it at the moment for the functionality category, but ULS as we think of it for the occupancy category. And you'll see if you look at those APOEs as we have them expressed at the moment, that they look quite similar to what we have. I would say there are a couple of things though that you might take note of. One is, at the moment, we don't have the 2,500 year return period earthquake at the far end of the importance levels. I'd say this is one thing which is still up for grabs, so don't necessarily quote me on that, but that's one of the things we're thinking. You'll see also that most of those, what I referred to a minute ago as the SLS2 of equivalent, have come up to the numbers that we have sort of 100 or 250 years. And there's some good reasons for that. We did have some discussion as to whether we would say, let's keep it at SLS1, very low or no ductility demand at that level. But there are some other factors that come into that, and one of the primary ones being that a lot of our major cities have liquefiable ground. Many of those, that liquefiable ground, at least most of that, is potentially triggered at a level above the 25-year earthquake we've traditionally used for SLS1. And so we felt that it was worthwhile setting that level a bit higher to make sure that we would trap most of those, because that will definitely have an impact on the functionality for many buildings. And so we're looking at the combination there of the relatively low ductility demand we might expect from those buildings, as opposed to probably not very much, and making sure we trap that potential step function. As before, you'll see that the highest occupancy category is still by special study, and so outside of the scope of that. Now, Henry somewhat propitiously said before that he'd like another lever to play with, so I guess the message from this was we've gone from having one lever to control everything to potentially having two levers, but that also gives us the opportunity to introduce a few other controls which potentially actually help us to do a bit better with our design, and hopefully that's where some of the carrot comes in that we've perhaps been missing from the earlier version of this. And so we're looking to introduce seismic design category. Some of you may be familiar with that from US or Canadian practice, and as I note there, we have kind of shamelessly borrowed it. We've used the same terminology, but it's not the same thing exactly. It's similar, and it will have similar effects, but actually there's a few other things we're doing. Now, a number of you have seen this slide before. I think it comes back to the Hardy-Cross quote that I can never quite remember, but it's something along the lines of strength is essential, but otherwise not important. And the reality of it is, when we look at earthquake and building performance in earthquake, we know it's not really generally the load it was designed for that really has the most impact on the outcome. If you've got a building which is regular, lots of redundancy, seated on good ground, all those good things, then you'll get much better performance, disproportionately good performance compared to the building which doesn't share those attributes. And so we're trying to find ways in the work that we're doing now to recognise that and potentially offer a bit of benefit to designers for those that wish to follow that good sound logic. Now, just a bit of a recap, if you're familiar with what happens in North America, here's a map from FEMA P732, I think it is, which is a very good document. I'd recommend it as a bit of background reading. But this is showing you the seismic design categories throughout North America, or USA, I should say. They think it was all of North America, but we know better. And you'll see that ostensibly it's really only the top two categories, as it's shown here, which are actually in the highly seismically active zone. And so California is D, E, and F. E and F being a combination of things, which is those little, you can just make out the red zones, which are essentially the near fault zones. But that's used, it's a combination of what they call the risk factor, but analogous to our importance levels as they used to be in the PGA, and that is used to then set limits for certain structural types. It helps you decide which structural types are allowed in which areas, and it helps you determine some of the configuration of the building. How we wish to use it is a little different, and we've got a little more bandwidth to play with because we're really only stuck in the small strip up the edge in that diagram, as it were. And so once again, with the proviso that you don't take this too seriously, don't take photos of it, and certainly don't show it to anyone else, this is what we're planning. And so the seismic design category will be a function of, on the one axis, the functionality category, on the other axis, the occupancy category. You'll see there that we have a bit of a question mark about whether, I don't have a highlighter, whether it might be related to the governing magnitude, and I'll get to that in a minute, but ostensibly it looks very much like you'd expect with some sort of a heat map going from A, which is very much what we have at the moment for all buildings, up to something which is going to be presumably a little more restrictive when we talk about Class E. Now, there won't necessarily be that many classes when we publish this in the long run. There's still a bit of work to do on that. The reason for the magnitude split is because we don't think it's probably necessary to ask people in low seismic areas, like Auckland, for example, to follow all the same rules that are put in place for highly active areas like Wellington. You saw in the previous diagram that the US tended to have that split around the near fault areas, but going back to what Rob told you a minute ago, we've got the near fault factors incorporated now into the seismicity, we believe, and therefore we don't necessarily need to make any further adjustments to that. But certainly it didn't seem valid that you would have to ask building designers in Auckland to go to the same level of effort as Wellington. And the reason for that was that when we look at the performance of buildings, a lot of the factors that we're talking about, these non-load related factors to do with configuration, are really found out when you get many cycles of inelastic demand, which is largely something that we're saying is related to magnitude. Hence, we're saying with areas of sufficiently low magnitude, earthquakes driving the seismicity, we can potentially relax some of those provisions. That'll typically apply from maybe around about Hamilton north, for argument's sake, and perhaps in some areas to the extreme west or east of the country. Southeast, I might add, not northeast. Looking at what those seismic design categories do, essentially, I won't go through word by word, but we're saying it will come back to from A with no particular requirements, which remember is exactly what we have at the moment. And as we go up the scale, we'll start introducing requirements around regularity, redundancy. Potentially it might change some of the forms of the buildings, forms of structures you're allowed to use, and or requirements about what seismic design type you should use, which I'll come to in a minute. The next thing we've introduced is a section on performance objectives. And I've given you both the, well, I've said previously and now, I should have already said now and in the future. So I'm jumping forward and getting a little ahead of myself there. But essentially we're saying at the moment, you've seen the high-level objectives in B1, and there's a bit of a gap between what appears in the verification methods in 1170.5. And the reason that gap is important is, first of all, to give a full briefing to the material standard writers, and secondly, for people who are doing alternative solutions. And so we have tried to bridge that gap somewhat by including a new section in here which addresses that, which is clause 2.2. And here it is, and the expectations for building performance, I won't once again read through it, but essentially it's putting it in not necessarily in numerical terms, but describing what we expect. And so what should happen in earthquakes which might happen frequently. The building should suffer minimal damage and should be immediately usable. And that gets then gets escalated as we go up, looking at the functionality categories, which you can just see a bit of there, and all the way through to what happens in that much bigger event, not the ultimate limit state, but something which exceeds that, and our expectation that the gravity structure should remain able to support the building. We then move to verification, which is very similar to what we have at the moment. Once again, though, you'll note there that beyond ULS, which has always been sitting in the commentary, has been pulled into the standard. We've clarified that 1.5 times the ULS drift. Again, don't take that to heart. That's something which we'll have further review before we get this document published, no doubt. We've also looked at lateral force resisting systems. Now, at the moment, we tend to refer them by ductility, limited ductility, nominally elastic, whatever it may be, nominally ductile, sorry. And there's a certain amount of, confusion about what those terms mean. And so we've tried to address that by giving them somewhat more enigmatic names, as you can see here, type 1, type 2, and so on. The real key point, though, is the words there that I've highlighted. And so a type 1 system is probably what we currently think of as ductile, but we've tried to be a little more, dare I say it, precise about it. A structure in which inelastic deformation capacity is relied upon and quantified. In other words, we need to be able to think it through all the way to the end. We can't just select a level of ductility and assume that it works. Type 2 is where inelastic deformation capacity is assumed, but need not necessarily be quantified. And typically, we would think of that as being some of the smaller structures where we can't necessarily follow it all the way through to the bitter end, but we know that they'll behave properly, whether it's through historic performance or whether it's through testing and verification, which is done outside of this process. Whoops, I'll go back. Type 3, inelastic deformation is not relied upon, and strength is primarily used to satisfy the performance objectives. We know that most of our structures are inherently ductile to some extent, but we know we can't quantify it. And there's a lot, it's very similar to the sort of mu of 1.25 type structures we all think of now, but there'll be some further requirements potentially where we use those and further limitations on their use, which may come as through this seismic design category. Finally, type 4, which is the brittle structures, and once again, exactly as previously, they are outside the scope of the standard. Looking at that diagrammatically, you've all seen the force displacement curves before, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on that. But the key points are probably that when we get to those type 3 structures, they'll need to have some sort of a buffer at the top end to make sure that they do actually have the capacity to do what we need them to. Type 1, we've got plenty of deformation capacity. We'll probably be designing that more for the SLS end than what we were, and then adding ductility. In other words, making sure that those buildings can cope with anything. We're also thinking, and that's yet to be tested, that where we've got the best of those buildings, the ones that really do have the regularity and the redundancy, there may well be some level of discount can be applied to the load to reflect that better capacity that they have to deform. And so that's one of the things which is for the next, I've just set my colleagues up to deal with that in the future. Finally, section 3, basic principles. Now, that's a little bit of a return to the past. Those of you who are old enough might remember the standards back in the 80s when we still had those things in there. We've tried to reintroduce some of that. There were some there was some good material which got lost somewhere in the translation from 4203 to 1170. So there will be discussion in there about what the appropriate material standards are and how they relate to what goes on in the loading standard. Requirements hopefully better articulated for load path continuity and structural integrity, which are obviously the key things which make structures work. There'll be the usual material about how you determine the earthquake actions and combine them, and further description about how those types translate through into how we establish dependable and elastic behaviour and capacity design. This is the high-level principles, not the detail. The detail will come in later sections. And finally, a note there about imposed deformations and deformation compatibility to make sure that we are actually following that. I have to say at this point, I'll repeat what Ken said earlier. All of this material is up for grabs. We are literally in the process of balloting that right at this minute. And so it's still a lot of this to be worked through. The purpose of this, I guess, was to give you all a bit of a preview of what's there and obviously to potentially elicit some response.
Thank you. Thanks, John. I'll try to forgive you for putting a map of the U.S. on a slide that said North America, but again, I'm in the position of saying sort of where to from here. As John was saying, we are in the middle of balloting those first three sections. And I think it's turning out to be more effort than perhaps we had bargained for, but it'll all lead to a stronger document in the long run. And so if you see John and Rob and Tim and I and others here arguing in the corner tomorrow, please just leave us be. Because we need to work through that because we essentially have three sections to ballot every 3 months for the next year to be able to produce this update by while delivering it to MB by March of next year. And so you can sort of see our schedule there. It's a pretty hectic, pretty ambitious schedule, but I'm feeling that we have spent the first year really just getting alignment on the general principles, and I think we've arrived at that, and it's really about now getting words down on paper and agreeing to those words. So I'm reasonably confident that we can get there. So then, what are the next steps from there? Well, all of this started back in with the National Seismic Hazard Model. Thanks, Matt. And that being released in 2022, and that kicked off stage 1 of the Seismic Risk Working Group, which then led to and then that was passed to the Standards Committee to consider, that Rob has reported on. And we're just coming to the end of that Standards Committee's deliberations now. And the new TS 1170.5 2025 will be available sometime this year. And it will be available for use for alternative solutions, as I was saying earlier. Where does the stage 2 fit in? Well, very much in sort of a parallel activity. So just like stage 1 led to the Standards Committee to produce the TS, the stage 2 is going to be doing the same thing. So stage 2 will produce a draft. They'll be handed over to Standards to consider that draft and produce yet another update to the TS. Notice the question marks on the dates on the bottom row. right? But just to give you an idea of the likely timeframes that we're looking at here, this is a fairly significant undertaking. Now, that's just the standard. Please bear in mind that there's further work to be done before that can then be the cited standard. And so there will be, of course, a regulatory impact analysis that's done, followed by a consultation that would finally lead to the citing. And this issuing of the TS for use as alternative solutions is very useful for us to inform that regulatory impact analysis. So we really know that we've got the right document when it goes to actually citing this in B1 VM1. So those are the next steps ahead for this document. But how about from there? Looking way off into the future, we really see trying to move toward a regular update cycle for key standards, probably grouping standards, let's say, into two groups, staggering those, and obviously the time frames here really start to stretch out. And again, there should be question marks on all of those dates. But just to give you a sense that moving forward, we are looking to having regular update cycles. And because standards are living documents, they have to evolve as our knowledge evolves over time. And with that, I think I'll invite Rob and John up to the stage, and I think Dion's going to help us with the mic. I'm not sure whether we have any questions online, but okay, whole bunch of questions. So we'll just work through these in the time that we have available. So first question from Jenny. John, will stage 2 likely result in a TS or an NZS? Does this matter from your perspective? I specifically just kept the TS and did not specify that it would be TS or NZS. I think that's a decision to be made by standards and by that standards committee that's established at the end of stage 2. From my personal perspective, I don't think it matters too much, but the TS looks and feels and smells very much like a NZS and has gone through quite a rigorous process, what with the balloting process done through the Seismic Risk Working Group. But I think in the long run, yes, we would like to evolve it into an NZS. How about for somebody else? John, why is the split in SDC proposed to be tied to magnitude rather than, say, the hazard factor or the hazard zone, which is already tabulated? Oh, where's that? Do we have a?
Yeah. Well, I think I can be a bit picky and say because the Z factor is kind of disappearing these days. There was a bit of a discussion about potentially tying it to the PGA, which will be tabulated. So if you've had a look at even I think the draft version of the TS, there were the big tables in the back of that. Actually, magnitude is tabulated for all places in that, so it is going to be available. I guess the bigger question was why not tie it to something which looked more like the hazard itself? And part of the reasoning there, I think, is that one, the hazard is a little bit independent of the duration of the earthquakes that might lead to that in some cases, although we're still working around that. And I'm speaking as one of the non-seismologists in the room, so I recommend you take one of them to one side if you want a bigger discussion about that. But equally, if the hazard in terms of the accelerations is already taken into account in the spectra, we didn't feel that was what we needed to be focusing on to determine that split.
It was very much the intent to choose a parameter that is tabulated in the new TS. You wouldn't need to go looking somewhere else. And also, I guess, another factor that's playing into the decision there is to have something that's independent of your site class, because this is something that's considered very early in the design process. A question for me in relation to, is it the intention to utilize or reference the TS 1170.5 in seismic assessments once it is cited in B1 VM1? Good question. And one that I will simply say that how we integrate new knowledge about seismic hazard and other factors within the seismic assessment of existing buildings is part of the subject of the review. So I can't make a call on that at this stage, but certainly in the foreseeable future, it is 1170.5 2004 for all assessments. Let's pick another one here, unless there's anybody in the room. Good to mix it up a little. Hamish?
John, really interesting to see potential to be getting rid of sort of IR4, 2,500 year return period considerations. And I know that a lot of those types of structures are in the kind of civil infrastructure space, bridges, and that sort of stuff. To what extent has there been dialogue with NZSEE, Bridge Manual, in terms of your deliberations, and is there sort of a alignment there, or has this solely been focused on sort of building space at this stage?
I'll answer part of that, but Ken might pick that up as well. No, at this point there's been no discussion as part of the seismic risk working group with the other potential users of the hazard model. I do think there's a good argument to say that perhaps we are driving these numbers up and up by looking at longer and longer return periods, and maybe we're better to think about other things. So just a little plug for what we're doing here. I guess you could say what we're giving on the one hand, we may be requiring other things to happen on the other. I think what we're really saying is, rather than just bang the load up and go to that 2,500 year return period, because we always have, let's focus on those other things which make those buildings perform better. And so you'll have seen in that slide I put up, looking at the seismic design categories, that we had D and E, I think, lined up along the bottom line with those high functionality category buildings. And really that's saying, look, if we do a better job of configuring those, we don't need to drive it right to those limits. And I think you could probably make the same arguments about other civil structures and things which aren't necessarily part of our scope, but which nevertheless will look at it. Ken, do you want to comment further on that?
I was going to ask whether Mustafa from NZTA is in the room, because I know that they are considering the impacts for the bridge manual. We are starting to work more closely with NZTA in our collaboration with Engineering New Zealand, and part of that is to get more joined up on these sorts of things in the future. Let's go back to another question over there, and while the microphone's going across, let me just take one of the questions here. For quantifying inelastic deformation capacity, would you say that that is in a way setting a collapse avoidance limit state? What would be deemed as the maximum inelastic deformation capacity? Yeah, good question. Still working through that portion of the TS, because that will really be defined within Appendix A as to what instructions we give to the material standards as to how they define that deformation capacity. But no, it's not intended to be a collapse limit state. It is intended to be a check at ULS. And it would likely be something along the lines of the peak of the low deformation response. So just before you start degrading the response of the component, that would be the deformation that you'd be checking against. But as I say, still work in progress.
Can I make a comment? I just make a comment on that also, that remember that Ken mentioned component performance. We're really thinking about holistic building performance, and that's really important at those very high levels of shaking, that you don't focus on components. It's the system performance.
Thanks, Rob.
Hi, hello, John. Actually, I'm from mainland China. I think it's very interesting to separate FC and OC, functionality category and the occupation category. Do you have any like so-called engineering demand parameters which can make you to achieve the target of the for FC and OC?
I'm trying to think how best to respond to that. We're still looking at how that work is being done, but I think it comes down to, yes, we've got the bits that I didn't show you, but in the verification methods section, we're already talking about how each of those is to be achieved for the limit state, and so that relates back to the to each of those, either the functionality category or occupancy category, respectively. And so essentially the process is pretty similar to what we do now. We start with the APOE, which reflects whichever category you're looking at, and that then goes to the requirements for the verification of the limit state, which will then feed forward into the design.
Yeah, the question I'm asking is because in China we are also thinking how to achieve functionality, how to achieve life safety. Mm-hmm. So probably we use more, like say, inter-story drift for life safety, and for use acceleration, or inter-story drift for occupation function or for functionality. So that's why I'm asking. I think if you have better data, probably you can share to the world. Thank you.
We're thinking along a similar lines, a smaller inter-story drift requirement for checking functionality. And I was very pleased earlier today, there was a presentation by Ruben who talked about in Chile how they've found that they don't really need to control the accelerations, that the functionality is really driven by the deformation limits. And so, yeah, our intention on the functionality side is using a drift limit.
Yeah, actually, the day after tomorrow, in 10th of April afternoon, I'm going to present a little bit about Chinese way to achieve so-called resilience. We have just recently have a regulation on some special new buildings, asking them to have to maintain functionality after the earthquake, like hospitals and like school buildings and others. So, thank you. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
And while Dion runs across the room, I'll take another from the screen here. Caleb says, has citing a TS been the standard process in the past for code update cycles as opposed to VM citing a NZS? Or what is driving this process? Yeah, good question. No, the only reason why we're using the TS mechanism through Standards New Zealand this time around was, perhaps ironically you might think, was speed. That the TS has somewhat quicker process through the approval process within Standards New Zealand requirements. And because we knew that the National Seismic Hazard Model was going to be of great interest, we wanted to get that on the street and available for use as quickly as possible. That was the reason for taking the TS pathway rather than the NZS. But as I was saying before, they look, smell pretty much very, very similar. It's just the exact rules within the approval process within standards are slightly different. So, yeah, most likely in the future, we would be moving over towards an NZS, whether we do that right now with translation of stage 2, or whether we do that down the track, yet to be seen.
Thanks, Ken. So it's great to see some carrots for adopting things like regularity, etc. I saw somewhere in the slides there was a line item for appropriate material standards, or some words to that effect. And I might be reading into this a bit, but is it semi-related, and that will all material standards be held kind of equal, or will there be some level of kind of acknowledgement of how long some material standards have been around or tested, etc.
I can't show any concrete bias here. No, no. Of course, the reference to appropriate material standards is simply a term used within the the TS to say it's a defined term, essentially, to say that any material standard that provides all of the information that the TS requires is called an appropriate material standard. It can be any material if it's providing the information required by the TS. Alistair.
Ken, it may be hidden in the small text you put up on the screen, but tricky question, why no displacement-based design?
There will be, in a sense, Tim. Where's Tim? There will be a pushover analysis introduced, and there will be elements of displacement-based design in that you're going to be controlled for type 1 structures at ULS by deformation capacity. So it is being, I guess, introduced a bit by stealth. Is Tim, do you want to add anything further, Tim?
Didn't really have much to add, but I think with the type 1, recognising that the idea is we're trying to demonstrate we satisfy the objectives through deformation checks, and if we have a pushover analysis approach introduced, then essentially you could do displacement-based design. I don't know where Alistair is. Oh, there he is. Yeah. You could do that, but to demonstrate compliance, you would use the pushover. Now, whether that's a pushover that you could do by hand or something more complicated, but it would be through the pushover route you would demonstrate compliance. So it's sort of around about, that's the current thinking, yeah.
And I think we need to wrap up here, but I'll answer Royce's question really quickly and say no, vertical spectra has remained the same. And I don't know what add, don't subtract means. Your slide? My slide?
I'm not sure. Yeah, that was me, damn it. I think what that relates to is sort of looking back. I think at the moment, the way we tend to think of ductility is something we can divide a big load by to get to something we like designing to. And people don't always take the step they should take, which is actually to demonstrate that there is an alignment there and that level of ductility demand matches up with the assumptions they made right at the outset. Whereas I think what we're saying is, particularly for those type 1 structures, that we can effectively design those at the SLS2 level when they're essentially elastic, and it's a much simpler analysis at that point, and then add ductility to get it out to where it needs to be. And that way there's no sort of, the designers aren't fooling themselves, if you like, because they've established it's going to perform well at that low ductility demand phase, and therefore adding ductility is going to always make it a safe structure, whereas I don't think we're always getting what we want at the moment by assuming a ductility without validating it.
All right, with that, I think we're going to close it up here. I do want to recognize the fact that John and Rob and I are just standing up here for quite a very excellent group of team and the Seismic Risk Working Group, and it really is a significant team effort. Huge amount of time and energy being put in by everyone in the group and the supporting team. So I thank you all for your support. As John was saying earlier, part of the reason for us sharing these ideas, even though they're not pinned down yet with you, is to prompt some discussion and get some feedback from you as we work through this. So please, over the next couple of days, corner us, except when we're arguing in the corner, and let us know your thoughts. Thank you very much.